meet water demand for camels, for goats, for, for even wildlife and for human use. Most of the time, when you give a pastoralist water, they actually don't think about their drinking. They think about their animal first. So, looking at technologies that can support us to calculate the water demand so that decision makers are able to allocate this water equitably and, help, help mitigate the conflicts around the water resources is very key. The third one is this mobile technology I mentioned. I know that in Kenya, more people have mobile phones than the poor people, and you'll be surprised. The mobile technology is doing so well in Kenya that we have M-Pesa, and we can develop mobile paid or prepaid water systems such that people don't put money, the tariff and the money they collect from water in their pockets. So leveraging this mobile technology that people have in the rural areas. In the middle of nowhere, you will find there is even no food in the shop, but people have mobile phones and they can talk and they're transferring money. So that's what I can say from the Kenyan context.
Thank you. Sandra, what's this?
Yes, so when I think about technology needs and solutions, absolutely the first thing that comes to my mind is ICT, information and communications technology. You're right, we need to, particularly as I think about the MENA region, groundwater is the primary concern. How do we measure it? How do we measure the resource, the quality of the resource, and so forth? That's extremely complex, and we need to continue to build technical solutions for that. Now, the reason why ICT investments would be important or critical right now, it's for improving our data, our databases, our hydrological data, for example, in how you're using it in Kenya. So it's the input of data into these systems, but it's also the distribution of this data to water users so that we can affect water user behavior, improve sustainable practices, whether it's for agriculture, it's in the house, it's whatever, what have you, but also for the purposes of to affect behaviors to respond to certain circumstances, whether it's in the middle of an extreme event of a contamination, flooding, or something like that, but also for if a risk of drought is seen coming over the long term. But it's just to inform water users so that they can behave appropriately. And that is, as you said, to mitigate conflict. If people are informed on what the risks are to them, or maybe they perceive risks that aren't really there, and better information can help mitigate a conflict that was absolutely unnecessary. The point is to inform the public more effectively. So it's putting data into this system, but it's also giving it back to folks so that they know how to behave, they know how to respond, and they also know what to be concerned about and what not to be. So.
Thank you. Jerry?
As we advance in this world of technology, I agree with what my colleagues have said, but there's the old adage of KISS, keep it simple. And that's the challenge is we don't package these in systems. And so if you ask the people on the ground to have to take this and that and this and put it together, just imagine how many batteries you have in your house of different sizes. And when you give different systems with different batteries, it's a different logistics chain. So somebody has to think this through. The U.S. in its Army and its overseas deployments, the biggest load it had was water, moving water forward. So what are they looking at right now? Distributed packages that will help you purify the water, reuse it, do those sorts of things, and recognize that we are not going to be having to have things move long distances. So when we give you something to use, it ought to be self-sufficient and self-explanatory and not put a burden on you that you don't need. And I think we have that. That's coming, but it means people, again, have to partner.
Thank you very much for those thoughts. We only have about 15 minutes left, and I'm told there is a very hard stop on the room at 4:45. So let me open this up to people who may have questions of our panelists. So does someone have a mic that they could pass them around to? Please, could you?
Hi, my name is Monica. I'm a student at American University, and I'm also a research intern at the Environmental Law Institute for their Environmental Peacebuilding program. And my question is more so tying the two panels together, the previous one and this one, specifically what Ken Konka was talking about water cooperation. From a more dispute resolution, conflict prevention lens, because water resources don't necessarily abide by national boundaries, where do you see a role for water cooperation, for example, in pastoralist communities in northern Kenya, to mitigate transboundary disputes and or to strengthen diplomatic relations between other countries, for example, Somalia or South Sudan, etc., and the ensuing conflicts around water transboundary-wise? Thank you.
Who would like to jump on that one?
Yeah, very critical question about transboundary water resource management. As you all well know, animals do not have boundaries either. They move. They don't know these, administrative boundaries. And you will read from literature that pastoralists and their own ways of moving and managing resources through what they call, elders or customary institutions. So in this case, if you look at Kenya and Ethiopia, the Kenya and Ethiopia border, they have what we call Dether Council. And this Dether Council is a Borana kind of elders. They have their own laws or customary agreements that they designate areas of, say, migration or areas where animals can graze during dry season and during wet season. Now, this is mostly determined by, during wet season is when it is raining. When it is not raining, they have strategic water points. And if someone comes from, let's say, Somalia and go bring the cows there, they have to abide or obey these local rules. So working with the customary institutions and working with the government of Kenya, people like in the UN, FAO to be specific, mapped out the migration routes and also mapped out the water points. Because if you have very few water points and you have very high concentration of animals, the conflict is likely gonna arise. And if you have water points without the patcher, the pastoralists are not gonna come there. So really there is a balance. When it comes to transboundary water resource management, Kenya, of course, Somalia and South Sudan have to work together. And there are modalities of working together, put together by IGAD and by AU, the African Union. So if you want, I can give you more information after this. There are many websites that you can visit on disaster risk reduction and how these peace agreements and transboundary water management is being done, particularly with the neighboring countries.
Does anybody else on the panel wish to respond to that?
I would make two comments. One, Ken mentioned the International Joint Commission, which is U.S. and Canada, and it's a contrast with the boundaries we have with Mexico. But that's been in operation for over 100 years, and they've had one time when the International Commission could not work together to solve the problem among the commissioners appointed by the nations. It's worked very well because you get the same people day after day working on a problem, and they begin to appreciate the other's challenge. The same thing started in the Okavango in Africa. It has not been as successful because the stakes are higher, and we don't have as long-lasting a relationship among those nations. But the concept of bringing people together on a continuous basis rather than periodically meeting to solve these jurisdictional issues, whether they're transboundary or they're the waters that you jointly share, it makes a big difference to have this relationship. So relationships mean a lot ultimately.
Thank you. Let me open that to our second question. Who would like to get the mic over here, please?
My name is Mahshid Kovari. I teach at Trinity Washington University, and my question is that, as we all know, when it comes to water shortage, women are the one that in most part carrying the burden. And I was wondering if and how you would address the effect of water shortage in years to come on women's status, particularly their education and their right?
Who would like to take it?
I can speak to that a little bit. Thank you for your question. I think, as came up at the lunch as well, the issue of women and water is it's a major issue of concern. It is a major issue of concern, particularly. I'm sorry to speak to the donors setting the agenda, but the donors on the incorporation of gender into water programming have been historically the driving force. So I'm glad to see that this remains an issue of high concern. Unfortunately, it's an issue of high concern because we haven't successfully mainstreamed gender into programming all that well, except for when it comes to WASH programming. Water and sanitation and hygiene programming has been the real focal point for improving women's circumstances. Now, we can certainly see that with climate change and so forth and already water-stressed communities, that women are going to pay a huge price over time if we don't target the risks to women as environmental security issues increase in those locations. As water becomes more scarce, it's more difficult to get water for the household and so forth. Women are going to pay a certain price for that. As we know, we often measure gender mainstreaming in programming. We often measure that in terms of, there are two big measures, in terms of head counts of women participating in meetings and institutions, and how many hours women are spending collecting water. Those are the two biggies, right? So we can expect that that projections of climate change in certain regions, women are going to pay a price for that at the household level. So that's just to reaffirm, yes, this is an issue. Now, I think there are several areas, though, that we need to take this agenda a bit further to improve gender mainstreaming in programming. Like I said, a lot of the focus has been on WASH, and we need to figure out how to incorporate gender more into water resource management programming, including transboundary water management programming. What's the question of gender and transboundary water management programming? If we're trying to facilitate transboundary dialogue, there are all sorts of complexities. Anyone here who's worked on transboundary issues knows there are all sorts of complexities and difficulties in facilitating those types of dialogues. But when we talk about marginalized groups, including women, how can we bring those groups into these types of discussions, into policy and decision making? I think we need to explore more broadly that question. We need to get beyond the question of head counts in meetings. How effective are women in participating in these institutions? Not just is there a gender office. I've seen this in research I've done in Yemen, for example, where there was a big push by the donors to set up women's offices in all sorts of departments in the government. This was before the previous government collapsed. And these offices were entirely ineffective. I interviewed a lot of these women about what they were doing and so forth. Well, nobody knocks on our doors, nobody seeks our input on policy, nothing. Donors had set up this office, they have a computer, and two women sit there every day and they are paid. However, they're not utilized in any way. So I think as we get into this question of gender mainstreaming, better gender mainstreaming for the long term, we need to figure out how to utilize women's knowledge better and how to improve their input into institutions, because they do contribute to water security at the household level. They can contribute to water security, on a larger level within a basin or what have you, because they are users. They are a part of this economy, and their opinion needs to be, and their knowledge needs to be utilized. So I think this is the broader question about how we need to include women to deal with this issue of water security.
If we had more time on this, the whole field of the engagement of women in economic development and secondly within water is just, there's just a huge dearth of data. And I think what's happened from my experience is that you see gender not really being mainstreamed in the development, broadly speaking, but it's mainstreamed into different aspects of development. But the parts have not yet been brought, in my judgment, together as a whole, not because people don't want to, they're trying to, but I think that we just haven't reached this point in the economic development process in terms of research in particular where the priority, because the priority has been set to expend the funds to gather the data, okay? And it's also an issue of leadership, too, that goes with it. Let me see if we have time for another question. Two more from our host, please.
My question is, and it gets to a couple of themes here, how do you keep the relevant stakeholders at the table over the long term? Because this is really complicated stuff. Part of my law practice is relicensing of dams in the Pacific Northwest, and it takes 4 to 10 years to do a relicensing, even under the best of circumstances, and yet keeping all those relevant stakeholders involved is very difficult over that entire period. And so you end up with Jerry's lurkers. I call them sandbaggers, but that's
Yes.
a slightly more pejorative term. But for very real reasons, they have lives. They have other things that they're doing. They can't stick with the dialogue and digest the data, which is very complicated, over the long course and arrive at the sort of give and take that results in a durable agreement. And by the way, just as a side note, more data is not going to get you there. We have the most sophisticated modeling data on U.S. rivers imaginable. It does not end the debate. It's about people. You're saying relationships. But what strategies do you have for keeping people together long enough to really understand the issues and come to agreement?
I give you two quick examples. The International Joint Commission is charged with managing the flows in the St. Lawrence River. They felt they were not adequate, so they formed a public interest advisory group to advise the technical people doing that. It was going to take 5 years, and they courted these people from each of the 8 different discipline areas: recreational boaters, hydrology, commercial navigation. Two things happened. They got worn out after 2 or 3 years, and you had to start building the bench to make sure they're replaced. Two, they were seen by their compatriots as turning to the other side, going over to the dark side, because the minute you convinced me of your argument, I was a bad guy. And therefore, that's a problem. And so it is a problem that has to be addressed. The second one is the National Academy did a study on the Missouri in 2002, in which they recommended a procedure, and it's in existence now, called Mr. RIC, the Missouri River Recovery Committee or something, where the group was put together. They got support from the federal government, independent of the authoring agency, technical support that helped them deal with this data. So it was presented in a manner that was understandable, and that became the critical part. In the IJC case, they used something called shared vision planning, where almost every model that was prepared in the sight of the members of the committee. So they understood what it was. They were simple. They used Excel instead of some other super program. So it takes a lot of effort, and it's not simple, but again, it's relationships.
I also think it's sustained leadership. We are in a society, particularly in the United States, where everything is transactional and quick, and the problems we're talking about are enormously long, as you pointed out. But I think there is a certain brand of leadership that is evolving, it's going to have to become more evolved to deal with these problems, where people have to recognize that they may actually, in their careers, have to make the decision if they want to be affiliated with solving a problem like this. It means they're going to have to stay with it, and maybe for a decade. And that requires a very different kind of thinking in terms of our culture in the United States, particularly when people are told, hey, you will have over a career of 40 years, a new job every 3 years, as distinguished from, if you want to play in this game, it may require a commitment for a very long period of time. Because we do turn our leaders over really quickly, and all that knowledge walks out the door. We have time for really only one more question, then we have to break up because of this. And I tell you what, we have time for, because I see just two hands. We could just be very quick with our question and our response. The person here and the person in the back.
My name is Marina Janis. I work for EcoPeace. And we actually, to answer a little bit of these questions, is that if you can identify objectives for the individual communities to get involved that is in their self-interest, that has a common goal for all of the communities, then you may actually have the long-term interest of getting involved. The key is to find those goals, and I was going to ask the panel if they have any ideas of how to identify those type of objectives in their local engagements.
Any of the panelists like to try?
Well, I just talked to somebody last week. I actually interviewed a professor of a local university in Thailand about multi-stakeholder engagement, and she said, look, she knows that there will be people who are not really be wanting to be involved with this at all. But something that she's done as an academic in the field and in the community is there was a problem of water pollution in one of the tributaries to the Mekong, and the community were very concerned. The thing is, after discussing with the source of the pollution, they found out that the company was also concerned with what they were doing to the environment and the community. So she said it was very clear to her that by identifying that there's a common concern that both sides wanted to work on, they agreed on, okay, let's work on this together further. This is something that I think all of us know that, find a common problem. It's a real problem. People will be engaged.
Thank you. Question in the back.
Hi, I'm Kevin Mulligan with Power 7. We actually do groundwater mapping, exploration, and development. And my question is really one of risk and management of risk, identifying risks, and sharing the ownership of that risk, and specifically when it comes to the cost of capital. For a small company looking to do business in an emerging and frontier market, the cost of capital to raise funds to actually execute a project are often prohibitive. And so we turn to the USAID, the UN, the more robust financing streams to try and raise money to execute those projects. But obviously the approval process is quite extensive, and the administrative bureaucracy to achieve success is extensive, so it's a burden for that small company. So my question to you is, just in your experience dealing with small companies seeking out public-private partnerships, how do you manage the risk associated with the projects that you're involved with and share that so that the project can actually be funded, financed, and executed?
Yeah, I'll give an example with the Kenya Rapid program, which is what USAID calls Global Development Alliance and what we call PPP. We have about close to 10 private sector partners, 3 governments, the Kenya, the US government, and the Swiss government, of course, the civil society organizations. One of the key critical challenge that all these private sector companies were facing, and the reason why they did not invest in northern part of Kenya, is because the cost of investment is very, very high. And the risk, bearing in mind that's where we have a lot of terrorist attacks, the road infrastructure, the electricity, and all these basic needs are not there. And so what we've been discussing with these small private sector companies is an idea where we work with the government to create enabling environment and provide incentives, but also work with the donors to buy, can I say, we call it shared risk, but the private sector call it like buying down the cost of, de-risking the cost of investment, the fast capital investment. And so with bigger companies, of course, like Davis and Shatleaf, that is distributes pipes and water pumps in Africa, and smaller companies like Acacia Water, based in Netherlands. They deal with their hydrologists. They don't have sufficient funds to pay for their ticket and pay everything to come to northern Kenya. But what we provide and what I think would be useful is this partnership where Millennium Water Alliance members who have a long history of working in these areas provide an avenue and provide a platform for linkages and try to cut down some of the costs while the government work on policy and enabling environment. We are also working with the finance sector where the banks, we introduce these smaller companies to them and they can be able to, to give them some capital. So we can, given the time, we can discuss more about how Kenya Rapid is involving different private sector actors, because they vary in terms of capital investment and they also vary in terms of experience working in northern part of Kenya. Thank you.
So we're going to have to wrap it up. I'd like to thank our panelists and also everybody for staying. And I think when I try to reflect on this very important conversation, which definitely has been far-ranging, I think what I'm hearing here is that when you look at the challenge of big water resource management, we began the conversation talking about the Mekong and big dams, that the solution from listening to the panelists and the way in which the dialogue has gone is that there is an intersection and definitely linkages here, but rather than looking at the linkages between sectors like water, energy, agriculture, health, that the linkages really tend to be between technology and data and communications and how that comes together. And that what it was intriguing to me, and part of an education of this process, is that you have to be very careful when you look at the intersections between technology, data, and communications, not to get lost too much in the cloud, in the sense of the very large data sets that are available, but to really keep looking at the practical applications and needs for this data. And I think the panelists came up with some really good examples. Obviously, one of which was the mitigation of conflict between pastoralists and agriculturalists once they had a fix on, well, how much water really is there, and what don't we know, and what can we dispute, and what can't we dispute, and we have to recognize that there becomes a certain area of trust when we both parties share a lack of information and we share some information. So I thought that was, for me, an extremely important takeaway. We also talked about what we all know, the enormous power of these mobile technologies and how to use them and how to access that information and how to share it. I think that one of the things that it's hard to answer, but we did tackle it, which is, well, how do you keep the sustained engagement of communities when these problems are so long, to the point from our friend from Jackson Foundation, and require a kind of sustained interest? And I think part of the answer was, indicators and measurements of progress. And in some cases, the indicators and measurements of progress is, in fact, the information that you're able to share and applying it somehow accretively over time. So I, again, would like to thank everybody. I did want to mention to you also that in terms of the discussion earlier today on the global water strategy that the U.S. government's been looking at, is that there is a stakeholders engagement meeting on October 28th that the State Department is hosting. And if you go into the Federal Register, you'll see the invitation there, and you may wish to want to go to it. It's a listening session, so basically it's the government standing back and listening to your thoughts on the components of a global water strategy. So to the Jackson Foundation, thank you so much for everything you've done for us, and to Senator Jackson also for the example he set, and to see his legacy live on is just tremendous. And to the Wilson Center, it's wonderful yet again that you've convened so many people who are so knowledgeable on such an important subject, and to those who have stayed here in the audience and participated. We're very grateful for your engagement. Thank you.